we're still in Chapter 2, but almost done. In fact, this is going to be the last video for Chapter 2 before we go on to Chapter 3. We're going to cover 2 modules. So as I've mentioned before, we've already talked about the parts of the neuron. We've already talked about when they kind of come together and form nerve systems, which is kind of like our highways. We talked about the different parts of the brain and what they do, and then the different ways that we study the brain in order to know what they do. And then in the last video, we talked about the divided brain. We also talked about Phineas gauge. So there's more these case studies that we use that help us know all about the different parts of the brain and what they do. But now we're going to talk about the other way that our body communicates. Because we talked about the brain and the nervous system, peripheral nervous system, somatic, autonomic, all that fun stuff. There's another whole way that our brain communicates, and it's with chemicals. And it's probably a way that our body communicates that you know the best through adolescence. And this is the endocrine system. And so, we're not going to go into too much detail about this. One, because this is covered more in health classes. And 2, again, it's an intro psych class, but it is important to know. And if you want to know even more about it, you should take my adolescent psychology class, because we talk about it in more detail. But essentially, there are different glands in our body. It starts with the brain, the communication, you have the pituitary system, but there's different glands later on and all throughout the body. It's a little different male to female. Again, take a health class. And these different glands secrete different hormones, different chemicals that then communicate with the body and help us to maintain homeostasis. Which hopefully, if you've ever taken a biology class or a science class, you know that homeostasis is just the way for your body to kind of maintain this nice equal feeling, like equilibrium. So maintaining the same body temperature, just all sorts of stuff, just homeostasis in any way, shape, or form. And so this is our endocrine system. And so you'll see there's the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, which we've talked about before, the pituitary gland, and then you have your thyroids, which are right here in the neck. You have your adrenal gland, which you'll never guess what that secretes. Yes, adrenaline, obviously, but other things as well. But a lot of times when you think about the adrenal glands, you think of adrenaline, so the thing that gives you that rush of energy. We've talked about the pancreas. And then, of course, you have the ovaries and uterus in females and the testes in males. And again, as I mentioned, we're not really going to go into that much detail. This is why this is going to be kind of a short video. But it's still important to know that there is the endocrine system. But in your notes and in these slides, because it might be hard to see here, it kind of talks about all of the different glands or hormones, what they secrete, and then kind of what that function is. So some of these you may recognize. So like in the pineal gland, there's melatonin. And for some of you that may have struggled with sleeping, you might have actually tried taking melatonin. And because this is just a regular hormone that your body secretes naturally that helps you get nice and sleepy. We will be talking about it in, I think it's Chapter 4, I might be wrong, but in a later chapter, when we talk about sleep, we're going to come back to talking about melatonin. But that's in the pineal gland. You have insulin in the pancreas. So especially if you know people diagnosed with, wow, I'm blanking on it, diabetes, there we go. With diabetes, that has to do with the pancreas and insulin levels not being able to maintain that homeostasis. And so it has to be injected. You have the thyroid, so that's your metabolic rate, growth, maturation. You might have also heard of people that have hypothyroidism or hyperthyroidism, and a lot of times for those individuals, it's either really hard to put on weight or really hard to lose weight, and because it's that break in homeostasis, that metabolic rate, their metabolism, isn't working the way it should, and either they put on too much weight, they don't put on enough weight, and again, it all goes back to homeostasis. So all of it, homeostasis. And you will never need to know, at least for the sake of this class, this in great detail, but it is there for your knowledge. And it continues on, because again, it's a huge system. So I've talked about it before, the adrenal gland, so coping with stress. So again, you think about that, adrenaline. But there's also the cortical steroids, epinephrine, norepinephrine. And then, obviously, the ovaries are for the females, and the testes for the males. If you want to know more about that, take a health class. But that's essentially all we're going to talk about for the endocrine system. Yes, it is important, but for the sake of Introduction to Psychology class, we don't talk about it as much. But there are later classes. Again, if you ever want to take one of the hardest psychology classes I ever took, take behavioral neuroendocrinology, and in that you hear endocrine and endocrinology. Fun class, but very hard. And it talks in more detail about the different glands and what they do. So now we're getting into the very last one, Module 2.7. Again, also very short. It's something that gets brought back and questioned over and over again, and it has to do with genes and behavior. This whole debate of nature versus nurture. And we have talked about this before in this class, and I can guarantee we're going to talk about it again. Well, I'm going to go into it, but it's essentially that whole debate of like how much of you is determined at birth, and how much of you is based on, your surroundings, your environment. Because, we talked about Phineas Gage. I think we want to go to the next slide. We talked about Phineas Gage and how the damage to his brain seemed to make him a completely different person. Again, people that knew him would always say, like, that's not Phineas. That's not the person that we knew. Yeah, he's alive, physically, but that's not him mentally. And so what made him who he was seemed to just be the parts of his brain. And so how much of that was just determined with his genes? How much of Phineas Gage was him from birth and it just developed throughout time? And then how much of it was due to, the way that he was raised, the environment that he was in. This is this constant debate of nature versus nurture. How much of us is essentially in our control and how much of it is determined at birth. And it's hard to say, it's hard to test, but there are a few ways that we do. So you have familial association studies. And so essentially it's analyzing shared traits or disorders among family members. So when we look at certain psychological disorders, when you look at things like alcoholism, you see that there is a familial connection. So unfortunately, if someone in your family struggles with alcoholism, you are far more likely to struggle with it as well. Now, of course, this brings up the whole question, does that mean it's genetic, or is it just because, chances are, if you have an alcoholic in the family, you grew up around them, and so your environment was kind of teaching you that, hey, this is a way of coping with stress or something like that. So it's hard to know because there is, and it says over here, a shared environment. So again, hard to test. Then there's twin studies. This gives us a little bit more detail because, when you have twins, especially identical twins, they are genetically the same, genetically identical. And so one would imagine that, if there were any differences in, how they behave, different things they had, it would be due to the environment. Maybe, maybe not. And so this gives us stronger evidence to the role of genetic factors. Again, you see things like psychological disorders, even intelligence. To a certain extent, there seems to be this link in our DNA, because when you look at identical twins, there's a lot of instances where there's a lot of similarity. There's still differences, though. And again, a lot of times they say that, even if they live in the same environment, you can't guarantee that it's the same experience. Again, like I've taught, I've seen identical twins that go to the same school, they have the same parents, they live in the same house, but they have different friends. The way they're treated is a little different. The experiences they have and how they feel about that is a little different. So even when the environment is perfectly the same, you still can't say, oh, then, all the differences are genetic. Because even in the same environment, and it's what I love about psychology so much, you can't guarantee that that means, it's just genetics. I always say all the time, but in every single room, every single individual is having a completely different experience, even though the environment is the same. So you can't guarantee that, environment isn't still playing an impact. And then finally, the last one is the Adoptee Study. In the kind of perfect situation that's the most accurate, you could say, for, the nature versus nurture is when it's identical twins separated at birth that then grow up in different environments. Because then, the genes are identical. The DNA is the same. And so again, you could argue that then any differences between the two is due to the environment. You could also argue that any similarities would then be due to their DNA. But again, even when reared in different environments, there's still some overlap. You know, are they in the same country with the same kind of societal norms? So it's very hard to know for sure, the nature versus nurture. For the most part, and because it's kind of the easiest way to do it, we tend to be 50-50. There's some things that there seems to be a greater genetic link. Obviously, there are certain ailments that you are far more predisposed to have. It runs in your family, but we still don't know for sure. But these are some of the ways that we look into it. And so essentially, that's it for the rest of this chapter. And again, this whole chapter was all about the physiological perspective of psychology. Since we've talked about all these different perspectives in the first chapter, so this is all looking at kind of the things that you can see under the microscope, things that are there, the different parts of the brain, the different hormones, you know, the parts of the neurons sending the messages through your body and communicating back and forth, afferent and efferent neurons. What we're going to be getting into next chapter is probably one of my favorite chapters. There's going to be some different experiments that we're going to be doing, which I will be providing for you if you're watching this, depending on how you're watching this. I'll have instructions. But we're going to be talking about sensation and perception. So what happens when we're viewing the world? You're watching this video right now. How are you perceiving it? Like, what are you seeing? How does the eye work? And we're going to see, like, even though our brains are so complicated and so smart, it can fall for the easiest illusions because it's so smart and it jumps so many corners. But we will be coming back to that in chapter 3. We are now done with chapter 2.